adults want you to do as being great and cool and popular. But when you're an adolescent and you're doing things that represent good grades, behaving in school, and intelligence, well, that's what adults want you to do. And that's the opposite of what is cool in adolescence. You're supposed to be doing the exact opposite of what adults want you to do. And for that reason, there's a change. But sometimes the really intelligent kids still end up being popular anyway. How do they do that? And there's a really interesting study that was done by Yanni Buchanan, a wonderful researcher at UCLA in California. And she did an experiment where she asked kids to rate how much that they think teachers would really value kids who put a lot of effort who had examples of a lot of effort or a lot of ability on a fictional task. She also asked kids to talk about how much they would find kids popular, varying how much effort or ability they spent on a task. So, in other words, there were 4 different vignettes that she read to kids. And those vignettes vary on those who were high or low on effort. Kids that she portrayed as saying they tried really, really hard to get good grades, or they didn't really try very hard at all. She also varied whether these kids were generally very smart or they were not very smart. So in other words, it was a 2x2 design, and there were 4 vignettes, those with high effort and high ability, those with low effort and low ability, and those with none each. Well, then what she did was she said, imagine that that child had a success experience. Let's say they did really well on a test. How would teachers feel about them? And she asked this to kids of varying ages. And what she found was, kids thought that teachers, regardless of the kid's age, would really, really like the students who were really smart and who tried really hard. So in other words, they had high ability and high effort. They also thought the teachers would really like it, no matter what the age of the kid, if the kid tried really hard on this task, regardless of whether that child was smart or not. That's pretty much expected. What was really interesting is what you can see on the right-hand side of this graphic, which is that depending on the age, they thought that kids would consider the popular kid to be the one that was really trying hard among kids that were young, and the kids that were not trying hard among the kids that were old. In other words, what they found was that as kids got older, they started to penalize the smart kids who seemed to be really trying to get good grades. It was okay to be smart. It's not okay to make it seem like you care about grades and you're trying to get good grades. As your effort goes up, your popularity goes down in adolescence, even though that exact same thing was being rewarded among younger children. It has to do with this change in values and the fact that some kids don't realize that they have to start adopting the peer values, at least outwardly, if they want to be popular. If they seem too much like a goody two-shoes doing what adults want them to do, then they're branded a geek and a nerd, and they start going down in popularity dramatically. We actually did a really interesting study with my own graduate school advisor, Annette LaGreca, where we asked kids in high school to tell us whether they were in the groups of kids who were known for being really smart, like the brains, if they were in the groups that were known to be the populars, if they were the ones that were more athletic, like the jocks, or if they were the ones that had higher on maybe even took drugs, the burnouts. If you've ever watched The Breakfast Club, that's what you're interested in looking at, was which kids fell into which different groups. But while we asked them that information in adolescence, my advisor had data on these exact same kids when they were in elementary school. So this is called a follow-back design. We were able to look at the kids in high school and then look backwards and say, these kids who ended up being a jock or ended up being a brain, what did they look like when they were young kids, and how did their trajectory of functioning differ over time? Well, here again is the sad story for the nerds. What you can see here was that when it comes to feeling good about oneself, people generally tended to have self-esteem from childhood to adolescence that was relatively flat. Their self-esteem didn't change over the 6 years between the time that there were data available at time 1 and then when they were in high school at time 2. But for some groups, and particularly for the brains most dramatically, these were kids that in elementary school, when they were just about 8, 9, or 10 years old, they had really high self-esteem. In fact, they were the ones with the highest self-esteem of anyone. But by the time they got to adolescence, and many of them continued, remember, these were kids in adolescence who were now the brains. They were known for being the high academic achieving ones. Their self-esteem plummeted more dramatically than anyone else. Here's some similar information when looking at social anxiety. You can see that young kids, at young ages to old ages, the majority of kids, their social anxiety went down over that 6-year period. But the brains, when they in elementary school, these kids had the lowest levels of social anxiety compared to anyone. And they were the only ones to show increases in social anxiety over that 6-year period from childhood to adolescence. Similarly, they also showed dramatic increases in their level of loneliness over the same period of time. Overall, the results suggested that there's something about being intelligent that is strongly rewarded when kids are young, probably because it's doing exactly what it is that adults want kids to do. But if those kids don't learn how to pretend that they're not trying so hard and now adopting new peer values, they are penalized. And our data suggested that they show increases in distress and too, but no one likes a geek. It's still the case that you're supposed to be a little bit sociable as well, and perhaps importantly, you're supposed to show that you're developing a way of fitting with what's the norm in your environment. So in adolescence, what's normative is to show that you're doing the opposite of what adults want you to do, at least if you're trying to be popular. In adulthood, we might see this in the workplace. Those people who kind of kiss up a little bit too much, they're trying too hard, that deviates from the norm, and we see those people being less popular in the workplace as a result. On the flip side, there are some people who really seem to blow off work. They don't care, they're pretending like, or they're really acting like they are not working hard when everyone around them might be working towards the team. And when you're doing something that deviates from that norm, also, that leads to less popularity among adults. So in other words, it's interesting to figure out whether at the workplace or in your neighborhood or in other situations as adults, are you demonstrating a way of fitting what the norm is, what seems to be appropriate to do, or are you doing something that makes you seem like you don't understand what is expected? And when you deviate from that, even in adulthood, it's something that makes you much less popular. And that's what we can take away from this experience of what we see in the childhood literature regarding the role of intelligence and popularity. Thanks. Start this next piece, I'd like for you to do a small exercise. Think back to the time when you were in kindergarten. Remember what it was like with your peers. Remember running around. Remember sitting in a classroom. Remember what it felt like. Try and get a good, vivid picture of what that experience was like when you were about 4, 5, or 6 years old when you were with other peers. I'm going to ask you to take a second to jot down a couple of notes to remind you of what story, what image you're thinking about. But most importantly, try and think about not just which image is standing out in your mind, but what do you think that story means to you? Why do you think that that is the story that stands out immediately when I'm asking you to think back to that age? Once you're done jotting that down, then start again. Okay, welcome back. We've been talking about all of the different things that play a role in why some kids are more popular than others, and what that might mean for us as adults. The last topic that we're going to talk about has to do with all of the things that parents can do, or family experiences can happen, that might lead some kids to be more popular than others. And this is a huge area of research in developmental psychology, so I'm just going to give you a little quick example of a few of the different topics, and I'd be more than happy to share more information as needed. Of course, the idea here is that we might find that there are things about parents that are then related to kids. But in specific, we might think about the ways that parents could play a role because of their own social skills, because of parents' own psychopathology, as well as other possible factors that might be genetically transmitted or modeled within the parent environment that might lead to kids' social competence and might lead to popularity. So this very simple question quickly becomes a very complicated one, because there are a number of possible parent factors that can relate to a number of possible child factors that would all relate to kids' popularity. Let's talk a little bit first about parent social competence. Is it the case that parents who are more socially skilled have kids that are more socially skilled? Well, the answer is yes. In fact, Martha Butalis has done some really interesting work showing that when looking at how parents interact with each other in a waiting room while their kids are involved in her own research studies, she can see which kids will be the most popular by predicting, she can predict that statistically based on how moms interact with each other in the waiting room. There's a very clear way in which kids learn their social skills based on how their parents model those skills. But there are a lot of different ways that we see that. Not only do we see a modeling of social skills, but also there are some parents that believe that social skills and social interactions are important. And those parents that tend to emphasize how much their kids need to make friends, believe that it's important to be nice to others, believe it's important to share, and not just believe that, but actually do something about that. They instruct their children to do that, and they demonstrate it by how they interact with adults themselves. That all seems to play a very big role. We also see that moms who have very large social networks of their own tend to have kids who do very well. Because moms who have very large social networks tend to know more people for their kids to get practice, learning how to behave socially. And the more practice that a child gets by putting them in situations where they'll interact with peers, they'll learn about how to resolve fights, they'll learn about good social skills, those kids do in fact grow up to be more popular. So all of those efforts really do make a difference. One of the things that's really interesting though is that Martha Butalis also found that simply asking parents to think about what their own peer experiences were like when they were kids is something that can be used to predict how popular their children will be. And that's the exercise that I just asked you to do. I asked you to think about an experience that you had when you were in kindergarten age. This is just the same thing that Martha Butalis did, and I actually did myself in my own dissertation. And I asked parents to report how much they could remember a specific story and why that story stood out to them and why they thought it stood out in their mind. And here's what some of those parents say. There were some parents that said, "It reminds me of how important it is to have strong bonds with friends. It was a great time." Or, "I had happy times with my friends. I felt confident and comfortable with myself when I was with them." If your story and why you think you remember that story has this kind of theme to it, then we would say that your recollections have a positive social frame. You remember your peer experiences as being happy and surrounded by good, positive social experiences. But sometimes, when people are asked the same question, and they're asked why they think that they remembered a specific story, they say something a little bit different. They say, for instance, "It reminds me how cruel and mean kids can be, and I always pray that my own kids, don't get hurt like that." Or, "It hurt so much that teasing was antagonizing to me and represents the pain we suffer as children to try and figure belong and people like us." And we would call these types of memories or explanations of why people struggled up as a negative social frame. Anything that represents something where people were being mean to you or being mean to others, or there was cruelty or hostility. But yet a third set of moms reported something that was far more anxious or lonely sounding. They said things like, "I was somewhat insecure, I cared what others thought, and I felt isolated." Or, "It set a pattern to me that made me uncomfortable in groups of strangers." So again, these were moms that talked about feeling generally like the peer place was scary and they were somehow left out. What's really interesting is that research suggests that if you ask moms these questions, and you code moms into positive, negative, or anxious, lonely social frames, you actually can predict pretty well how well their kids will be in terms of their popularity. So here's the social preference score. Remember, that's likability of kindergarten kids grouped by whether their moms were in positive, negative, or anxious, lonely social frames. And the most dramatic finding here you'll see is moms that had negative social frames have kids that are really low in likability. They were much more likely to be in the rejected group. Whereas, of course, moms who had positive social frames had kids who were much more likely to be popular. They had high scores of likability. But an interesting thing happened with the moms who had anxious, lonely social frames. In research studies that have looked at this, those moms sometimes have kids that do well, or in this case you can see, have kids that do a little bit not so well. They tend to be a little bit disliked. And the reason why moms with anxious, lonely social frames tend to have kids that may do well and may not do so well is because it seems that those moms really vary on whether those anxious, lonely experiences have led them to teach their kids to withdraw from peer experiences, in which case their kids get pretty rejected, or if those moms decided to reinvest in their kids' peer relationships and make sure their kids didn't have it as hard as they did. Some of those moms decide that they are going to put extra effort into their kids' peer relationships to make sure their kids are not anxious and lonely like they were. And when those moms do so, their kids do just as well as the moms with the positive social frames. And that leads us to wonder, what is it that those moms do? What is it that a parent can do within their social environment that might make their kids more popular? Well, again, there's lots of information here and a huge literature, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. But basically, moms and dads can do things to change the way that they coach their kids through peer experiences, how they manage their children's social interactions. There's also some things they can do to change the environment that their kids are brought up in. The way that that family experience is different will change their children's developing social confidence and ultimately their kids' popularity. Of course, they also can provide ways of demonstrating right in front of their kids how to interact with others, how to make an effort and be nice and share and be social. And that also can play a role. Really briefly, I'll mention that when it comes to the social environment, we see that kids who have a strong attachment to their parents, and by this I mean classic research that suggested that within the first 2 years of life, There are some kids that show an ability to connect with their parents, and their parents show an ability to provide warmth with their children that allows children to go out and explore in ways that feel safe. That's called a secure attachment. And that's contrasted with parent-children dyads that have an insecure attachment. Kids who feel like they can't leave their parents safely, or kids who feel that even when they're with their parents, it is not a warm and supportive experience. We found, people have found that kids who come from securely attached relationships tend to do much better with their peers than those who are that come from insecure attachments. We also know that parents that express their emotions with their children in very appropriate, adaptive ways that let them know when they're happy or sad, and they explain those emotions, those things do really well. Moms and dads who play with their kids have kids that do really well. Dads who tend to engage in more rough and tumble play with their kids. Moms engage in more turn-taking play. Results suggest that both of those types of play are important for kids to do well. Moms and dads each contribute something differently. Doesn't matter if it's a mom or if it's a dad per se. It's just good to get a broad repertoire of parenting behaviors. And parents who provide, again, a warm, supportive, but still sometimes strict parenting style tend to have kids that do much better than those who come from parents who are very, very permissive or very, very strict without being there. There's also a lot of research to suggest that the ways that moms hover around their kids while their kids are engaging in experiences with their peers tends to play a very good role. So those moms who have that directly monitor their children, they watch their children, they're there to make sure that their kids are behaving well, that's good. Kids that have parents who continue to directly monitor them that closely, even as they're getting older, that's not so good anymore. That's too much oversight. It's much better for parents to do more indirect monitoring at that point. They might stay far away from where their kids are playing, or they might not even be there at all, but they do still check in and ask how their kids did. And that's good as the kids get older. Moms who do that have kids who tend to be more popular. We also see that moms and dads who tend to initiate more frequently play contacts, both structured and unstructured activities, that tends to be really helpful. By structured activities, I mean things like signing them up for Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, or signing them up for the soccer team or ballet classes. It's good to sign up children for structured contacts if you want your child to be popular, but it's also good to have a healthy amount of unstructured playtime as well. Not everything has to be structured. And providing children with both of those types of peer experiences does seem to make kids more popular over time. And last, of course, parents that tend to coach their kids, even in the middle of an argument between their child and other peers, that kind of coaching can be really helpful, and that's what a lot of anxious, lonely moms do sometimes to make sure that their kids are still in the peer group, and even if they're feeling hesitant or shy, they're coaching them right there to make sure that they're interacting, initiating contacts, and establishing new peer relationships, and all of that pays off for popularity. So overall, it's really important for parents to play a very active role in their kids' social lives, but be sensitive to the differences in their kids' needs as kids get older. And parents that do that tend to have kids that do much better in terms of social competence, and they're also much more popular. I've talked a lot about moms because almost all of the research in this area is on moms, but we are seeing with every passing generation that dads are playing a much, much stronger role in how they are rearing children, and hopefully the research will soon catch up. So far what we see is that everything we see for moms applies for dads, or a second parent as well. Even if they're not a dad, it can be any kind of co-parent that provides something incremental above and beyond what a first parent might provide to kids. So that's also very important to do. And we should think about how our own popularity might change the ways that we are thinking about peer experiences, and how our own experiences might be changing the way that we're socializing children as they are growing up and learning their own social skills. The research suggests that everything that we're doing in those areas is making a difference for our kids' popularity. Back. We've been talking so far about different kinds of popularity, specifically likability and also status or social reputation. And we've also been talking about some of the factors that make people popular, either among youth or among adults. Now what we're going to do is we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about how popularity changes our mood, our feelings, and our behaviors. And specifically what we'll be talking about are a few different types of outcomes. So first we're going to talk about what's referred to as externalizing symptoms. These are things like aggression, deviancy, ADHD, cognitive disorder, and even social truancy. We're going to then move on to talk about internalizing symptoms, things like depression, anxiety, loneliness, self-esteem. From there, we're going to move on to talk about health risk behaviors, things like substance use and risky sexual behavior. And then last, we're going to spend some time talking about avoidant outcomes, including the ways that popularity in childhood affects our relationship satisfaction, our employment status, and even our physical health in adulthood. So we're going to get started by talking first about the ways that we've gone about understanding the effects of popularity on these outcomes. First, I want to tell you a little bit about some different methods that people have used to try and study this question. And then we're going to talk a little bit about different theories that we've tested to try and understand those effects. So it was actually back in the 1960s when psychology was still being influenced by Freud and the thoughts that moms were responsible for all of our development. There was a series of research studies that demonstrated that maybe peer relations were way more important than we even realized. What ended up happening was that a few researchers were trying to understand why some people were most likely to experience psychopathology. This meant that either they were getting outpatient treatment or, more commonly, inpatient treatment for severe difficulties. They were also looking at some of the reasons why some folks in the military were honorably discharged compared to those that were dishonorably discharged. And there was a lot of research being done to answer those questions back in the 60s. So what they did was, they were trying to understand all the possible predictors for those outcomes. And they were able to look at lots of things, especially when they were looking at folks from the same community. They could go back and look at those school records and even the criminal records from back when they were adolescents. So they looked at arrest reports, they looked at IQ, they looked at grades, they looked at teacher evaluations, they looked at parent-child relationship quality. And it turned out that while many of those did predict which kids grew up to have psychopathology or dishonorable discharges, there was one factor that seemed to play a role even above and beyond all of those other factors. And that was specifically how popular these kids were back when they were in elementary school and middle school. So specifically, I'm talking about the kind of popularity that has to do with likability. So remember, this is popular, rejected, neglected, controversial, and average. The kids that we are calling to have high social preference, they're more liked than they are disliked. There's something about being really well liked that seems to be protected for us as we grow up. And there's something about being disliked that predicts these outcomes even decades later. So we call that a follow-back study. This is where we can look at an outcome that we're interested in adulthood, and then go back and look for school records or other kinds of available records to understand what factors might predict outcomes. Follow-back studies are really helpful because you can make sure that everyone in your sample has the outcome they're interested in as adults, and then you look back at their childhood records. But the problem is, of course, that those childhood records may or may not have all the information that you want, and often it wasn't collected in a systematic fashion. Also, what's hard is it's impossible to really determine whether those things you're looking back on might have been related to the things that really predicted the outcome of psychopathology or dishonorable discharge. In other words, we call those third variables. Variables that might have affected both kids' likability and also those kids' outcomes when they grow up to be adults. So we can't control for that. But for all we know, in follow-back studies, there may be some folks that had difficulties with aggression or psychopathology when they were kids,